So hopefully I will go under time so we even have more time for a Q&A. The title for today's talk is Colliding Racial Ideologies, Understanding and Fighting Colorism and Anti-Blackness. And it's rather general, but you'll see how it gets much more narrow. So just in general, I'm an interdisciplinary scholar with an MA in Latin American Studies and a PhD in Ethnic Studies. And I've always had a teaching pedagogy that has very much complemented my research focuses. So we know that bell hooks and so many other folks really believe in making the classroom a democratic setting where everyone feels responsibility to contribute is a central goal to transformative pedagogy. I've been teaching at UCLA for 10 years now. And what I've found most profound about teaching is that the classroom is also a healing space. And that's very powerful. And that's what I found specifically when I began to teach the Afro-Latino experience in the US. So I am a scholar activist. Racial justice has always centered both my research and my outside work. I center Black and Brown experiences. I worked for the Coalition for Humane Immigrant Rights of Los Angeles, as well as the labor and political organizer for the Service Employees International Union. So before I began my PhD, I had a lot of on-the-ground experience that I think gave a lot more nuances to the realities of my research. So I've always worked and I've centered my research on Latinx, race, and immigration. So my MA in Latin America and in Latin American studies and current research is looking at anti-Blackness and colorism, specifically within the Latino community. And this always has been near and dear to me. I've had several commentaries where I write about colorism within my own family. So like many of us, color is always relative, and I was the darkest person in my family, and no one else had curly hair. And my brother was blonde-eyed, and my sister was, very light-skinned with straight hair. So of course, I was relegated labels like morenita, negrita. And as I'll talk about later on, this arguments that they were comments of endearment really didn't really prove to be true in my case and in most folks' case. And I think that's something that we'll talk about much more further. So I always was very, wanted to know more about my ancestry and very clearly understood that like most Latinos, we had some Spanish, Black, and Indigenous blood. And so I've spent a lot of time in Brazil, Colombia, and Puerto Rico with Black movement leaders. And looking at the formations there, and then also, of course, looking at it in the US. And more importantly, which I'll be addressing today, is that cross point of those racial ideologies. So the methods are that I went up to Chicano Studies and I said, there's a clear need and there's a clear desire and demand from students wanting to know about the Afro-Latinx experience, and I think it's important to offer a course. And so on the first quarter, I think it was capped at 35. And so when I got to the class, there was over 70 people in the class, and it was standing room only. We had to move to a larger classroom. And so it was very clear that this class was in high demand and it was really important. And so on the first class, we had over 70 students, and then the second time we had over 100 students. Now, this is really important because we understand that race is always relative and it's always regional. So I think for the most part, a lot of the work came out of either New York, Miami, clearly because those were more higher rates of self-identified Afro-Latinos. So I think what I wanted to look at is specifically, what does this look like in Los Angeles and how do folks talk about it, where most of the Latino folk are from Mexico and Central America and have particular racial scripts, so to speak. So I had the initial questionnaire where I asked the students, why are you interested in this course? what are your expectations, and share an experience you find that will be related to this class. So there was long class discussions, and what really proved to be very interesting to me, and the students said it time and time again, was this was the first time they were able to speak about these secrets, so to speak, that they were able to voice the colorism in their families, and many of them who live side by side with African Americans in Los Angeles also talked about the anti-Black comments several of their family members made, and how they had to mitigate that and how difficult that was. And so they began to hear other Latinos voice similar points of view. So I'm not even going to go through the literature review. There's ample literature on race relations and race formation in Latin America, equally so in the United States, and we are now have much more literature on Afro-Latinx experience in the U.S. And these are all really critical. I think for the most part, people tend to study race in Latin America or race in the U.S. for obvious reasons and technical reasons. And what I'm trying to show is that these things are colliding for many of our Latinx students, particularly ones who are second generation, who have immigrant parents, and they're having to really mitigate this landscape where their parents had an understanding of a racial order, which is different in the U.S. So again, that really leads back to the uniqueness of the Los Angeles context, where there is less research on this. And so we're within the Los Angeles context. We have, again, most of these students are Mexican, identify as Mexican, Central American, many of them 1.5 generation or second generation with immigrant parents. Many of these folks live and attend K through 12 with African Americans. They have friends who self-identify as Afro-Latinx. We see that oftentimes the level of racial consciousness for these second generation youth are higher than that of their parents. They understand the similar barriers and experiences of African Americans and Latinx. And we see, which we have seen a lot of, many of them are active participants in the Black Lives Matter movement. I would venture to say this was not necessarily the case 20, 30 years ago, even within Los Angeles. The context, time, and space make things change. And so for me, I felt that it was really important to map this and really see what the youth, how the youth were both speaking back to their parents about race and then making their own identities and friendships and moving through the racial landscape in the US. So one of the main themes that most of the students talked at length about was colorism within the family. So here Lola stated, growing up, my skin color was a lot darker, and my mother always told me to stay out of the sun because I would get uglier if I did. So many of the students talked about that. The way that color or race was talked about was usually in a negative sense, if talked about at all. So if race and color were talked about, it was in these very, very negative forms. And it was really interesting, the amount of stories that were like this, and also this sense of, so for example, one student said that her family would call the darkest member in her family was her aunt, and they would call her shadow. And so even as she was a little girl, she understood that this was really bad and it made her aunt feel really bad, but she didn't necessarily have the language or the tools to kind of process it. And it was also interesting when we further asked folk, like, so, if where does your darkness come from? And it was really interesting that some students would say, well, we're just brown. That doesn't mean we have African descent. Well, we're just dark because our parents tell us we're dark because we're out in the sun a lot. So this significant amount of erasure of Blackness in Latin America, that the parents bring with them and teach their children this, leave a lot of the students really desiring to know more about their ancestry and to know more about who they are, where they come from, understanding that they're mixed, but wanting to know more about that. So equally, the students talked at length about anti-Blackness. So Armando stated, I remember there was a time when Honduras was in the World Cup and my uncle was watching the game and yelling racist things about the Black players. So again, this was a very common story that many of the students told, where there were explicit comments against Black players, even though they were of the, from the same country, and that this is the rhetoric and narrative. This was the dominant rhetoric and narrative that a lot or most Latinos grew up with, hearing from their own parents, even brothers and sisters, aunts and uncles, and many of them spoke about how they were very uncomfortable and very upset, often because they were like, "Wait a minute, we're brown, we're also dark," and not understanding how that made sense. So some of the other findings from the course, again, as I stated, that this became a really great safe place for students to speak about the racial internal conflicts in their families and communities, often for the very first time. And a lot of folks found this very liberating, and we often had questions about, they would say, Dr. Lacayo, what are ways that I can tell my parents, not to say these racist jokes, or for my uncle not to make these types of comments? It also allowed the students to understand their history of African descent. Many of the students did not know that slave ships were brought on the shores of Mexico and the rest of Latin America. They had very, very little knowledge of their history, their own history, especially as it pertained to their racial history. So they also gained an understanding of the struggle of Afro-Latinos and how to be allies. So that first year that I taught the class, we actually had the president of the Afro-Latino student organization with several other members, and they were really great at challenging the students, educating the students, and it often became points of solidarity. So they also began to strategize how to show the solidarity and practice different traditional and creative tactics to gain social justice. As Latinos, African Americans, and Afro-Latinos populations continue to grow and live side by side, many of these students will go on to be leaders in these communities, and gain this understanding will poise them to be leaders with solutions that will counter divide and conquer tactics and fulfill America's promise of equality. So a lot of the students really spoke about that this increasing of this racial consciousness for themselves within their own group and across other groups was really critical, particularly in places like California, where we're seeing majority minority populations, and this sense and feeling and desire for Latinos that wanted to build a stronger coalition amongst folk of color. So I'm again in the early stages of looking at these racial ideologies. We can compare and contrast the dominant racial ideologies in Latin America and the US, and even these are overgeneralized, of course, and even in Latin America, there's several countries and they have different racial formations. But in general, Latin America has been thought of this racial democracy, this racial paradise, where racism didn't exist and all was well, in part because of mestizaje, that this idea that everybody mixed, so we really couldn't tell who's who. And anyways, everybody's Brazilian, everybody's Cuban, everybody's Mexican. So this national identity would dominate and not have folks talk about their racial understanding. This, of course, leads to an erasure of Blackness, of folks not knowing their history and not knowing their African ancestry. This is very different in terms of the United States, where we have the one drop rule, where it's very clearly demarcated from early on that who is Black is anybody with one drop, and that those boundaries were much more hardened. the anti-miscegenation laws, which prevented mixing, and then the Jim Crow and segregation era, where it was very clearly thought that Blacks were inferior, relegated to second-class citizenship, and really thought to be not deserving of equal rights, not deserving of the identity of an American. And so here we see Black power movements in very particular ways. This is not to say Latin America doesn't have Black power movements, but the manifestation of the Black power movements in terms of Black is beautiful is often different from how other folks tend to think about this. So this is really important because what's happening is the parents that are coming from Latin America are coming from a particular racial ideology, racial landscape, and racial narratives, which then often collide or contrast, or are certainly at a crossroad with those of the United States. So these students, these young students, are often having to deal with that, right? So at home, they're dealing with, that the views of more of Latin America, and then they go out into their real world, and it's different. And so they're having to manage that, figure that out, and so this becomes really a really important way of thinking about or mapping the experiences of Latinos as it pertains to the racial order in the U.S. I wanted to say one other quick thing. All right, so this then leads to, again, for a lot of these folks to have to reconcile. So we know that there's a photography project on Blaxicans in Los Angeles. This is specifically one parent who's African American and one parent who's Mexican, that really looked at the increase when you have more and more Black and Latinos living side by side. That usually tends to mean that there's going to be more folks having children. And so the students talked at length about how they had to resolve this for themselves. They had to resolve this within their family, their community, the circle of friends, because of course this is helping them shape their identity, their perceptions of Afro-Latinx, and moving on to what kind of political behavior they're going to move into. And I will say one of the points that we really talked about is this point of family. So the students would talk about, especially students who had been called out in their family as the darkest and treated without preferential treatment, often treated very negatively because they were the darkest person in the family. Oftentimes we had students in the classroom crying because they were saying, it's one thing to face discrimination and racism from a white person or a stranger, but when it's your own mother, right? When it's your own father saying this to you, there's definitely this psychological trauma. And so the students talked about that, and it often, again, was the first time they did. So what we're seeing, and I think this is also interesting, and this is where my research is going to go in the future, is looking at how this increases racial consciousness for many Latinx folk, because they're actually having personal experience within family, community, and the dominant group. There's an increase in Afro-Latinx immigrants, Latinx wanting to know more about their roots. One of the parts that we talked at length about was popular culture, the rise of reggaeton. One of the places that reggaeton, which we know is rooted in Black Puerto Rican culture and Black Puerto Rican struggle, when the reggaeton artists come out in LA, those stadiums get packed, and they often have to do multiple concerts. And so that popular culture has lended folks to really the desire to want to know more about the African descent within their own family, but also in general. And so we've also seen a rise in Afro-Latinx celebrities who specifically identify as Afro-Latinx. And one other major thing, particularly with these new generations, millennials, is the social media. So we've seen discussions, about just recently J-Lo using the term negrita, negrita from the Bronx in her song, and folks really having a problem with that. And folks like Amara La Negra, who went on to the Breakfast Club radio show, and was really spoken down to because folks felt that she needed to pick between being Latina or Black, and folks not understanding this Afro-Latinx identity. We've had now conversations about Latinos folks using the N-word, and then of course Cardi B, who is self-identified as an Afro-Latina, and how some folks perceive her differently. So we've seen there's been much more, particularly popular culture, which really makes a lot of Latinos really want a desire to know more and create this solidarity. We've also seen alternative platforms like The Mezcla, Me Too, Hip Hop Latina, and many more who are providing spaces for Afro-Latinx voices. And we've even seen some changes in Univision and Telemundo and Spanish radio stations who have finally hired Afro-Latinx folk, and that increases representation and coverage again of Afro-Latinx the experience. So what I want to say in conclusion is that I felt really honored to teach these courses because a lot of these students, didn't know how to talk about these things, and they didn't want to be labeled or judged because they were kind of new to the scene, so to speak, and they really had a desire to want to know more about themselves, to know more about their ancestry, and to really fight both the anti-Blackness within their families and with the larger society. So, examining these interrelations between Latinx and Afro-Latinx is really critical. Interrogating how Latinx folk interpret and manage these multiple racial ideologies, especially as we move forward, I think will be very critical. And one of the things that we're capturing here is new identity formations, racial landscapes that can possibly lead to an increase in solidarity among Latinos, Afro-Latinos, and African Americans. And there's often folks in the class who, after the class, will say, I now identify as an Afro-Latino or Afro-Latina, and I'm proud to do so because I know now more of myself. And that's not a negative category. It's a positive and empowering identity. So these are the things that I'm working on and I'm thinking about. And so I can't wait to hear folks' questions and comments. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Celia Lacayo. We really appreciate having you here tonight, and thank you so much for sharing your experiences and your research and your work with us here today. We really value these conversations, and we think it's necessary to have them within our community for progressivism within our own homes and communities. Our second speaker of the night is Professor Zaire Dinzey-Flores. Zaire's research focuses on urban spaces and their relationship to race, class, and social inequality. Professor Dinzey-Flores is also the author of Locked In, Locked Out, Gated Communities in Puerto Rico City, where she provides ethnographic research on race and class relations in Puerto Rico. Everyone, please welcome Professor Zaire.
So hi, for me it's evening or night. For you all it's evening. I'm out here in the East Coast. And so I'm very happy to be here and being in conversation with Professor Lacayo and all of you. I'm gonna shift a bit the geography and to speak of sort of urban inequality and race inequality in the context of Latin America, although there are intersecting kind of conversations, obviously here, particularly when referring to race and racism among Latinx communities. And so it's pretty much a hemispheric lens, right? We cannot escape that, like, national cross borders, eroding borders kind of conversation. So I'm going to share my screen here, and hopefully I can stay to 20 minutes, but I think I was a little bit ambitious here in prepping. And let me move to make this a slideshow to make it a little bit bigger. So building race inequality in Latin America, in the Caribbean, and I have been talking a lot about Afro-Latinidad in the past few months, and so happy to kind of engage that conversation along with Professor Lacayo. But I'll start here. Racial inequality is a fact. I'll start there. Yet many, as Professor Lacayo has stated, have understood Latin America and the Caribbean as a site where there has been an extensive mixture of races that has resulted in a racial gradient, which puts people in close proximity and filial relationships. So, as opposed to the one-drop rule that was referred to. And for a large part of Latin America, the question of race has been intrinsically linked to that idea of one people, right? Or one nation, one culture. And so ideologies of mestizaje promoted this sort of like mixed subject that really excluded unadulterated, what were thought to be unadulterated racial subjects, because they're a threat to national unity, right? So this idea of castas really emerges from that, which is the poster on the left, which is this sort of way to understand racial mixing and the miscegenation as a process of erosion of the pure kind of races, Spanish, white, indigenous, then understood as Indio, and Black African, understood as such then. And so, these were not only, this was, the colonial enterprise that produced these racialized societies, and I'll say more about that, but not only racialized, but also hierarchical. Racialized in that, there were sort of white on the top and through indigenous and Black at the bottom. And if we see that sort of book from Peru, you can see sort of this ideology that always coexists or always lives. And this is a book from 2010 from Peru. And I'll read what it says in Spanish. I'll read it in English. But the text in the book says, the first race emerging was the white race, then emerged the Indians because the water was already muddy, and finally some came out Black, right? As it got dirtier. So not to forget that this mixing that is purported to be sort of like create a racially democratic society actually is, imbued with all sorts of values and inequities in power, and has always been. So this process of miscegenation, of supposedly racial mixing leads to this idea of, what the Latino, Latina, Latine, Latinx looks like. And it always can look like Shakira and J-Lo and Justice Sonia Sotomayor, and I'm blanking on her name here. Somebody help me out. On the left there, the actor from Texas. Oh, I can't hear you, but you know who I'm talking about. And then like Antonio Banderas, even Antonio Banderas, who's Spanish, sort of like making this claim to Latino. And this is a lot of it in the context of the US, but we get the idea of what Latina looks like. And Latina looks like this. Latino does not look like any, Nolasco, Tatiana Lee, or even Reggie Jackson, who was Reginald Martinez Jackson, Puerto Rican, or Ariana Curtis at the Smithsonian, and of course, Schomburg, Arturo Schomburg, who's actually the archivist of Black materials and literature, and that for which the library, there's a library for, and much of that archiving happened, during the Harlem Renaissance, and often forgotten. Now, I mean, a lot of scholars have done a lot of revisionist work, but had been forgotten as a Puerto Rican subject and only understood as Black, which typically means, in the context of the US, African American. I'll even say that in the context of even our hemispheric, right? The borders are not static, they're porous, they're not firm. Even outside, Black subjects have almost become understood as African American, and that's a personal experience for me. I'm always understood that way, no matter where I am. When actually, if we think about it, and I love showing these graphics, and I won't go over to this slate graphic on the left, but I'll talk about the right one. The fact that it's largely unknown, more people are getting to know this, but that the majority of people who were, put in bondage and enslaved and transported to the Americas went to Latin America, to Central and South America and the Caribbean. So only 7% went to North America, and only 4.6% went to what is now the United States. So that means that 95%, right? Like almost 95%, or 93% went everywhere else, and if you include like Belize and Central and Mexico in it, more than 95% of people who are Black were transported to places that were not the US. And so that graphic on the left, I encourage you to go see. It's an animation of the ships being transported, the counted ships going from Africa through 4 centuries, 3 centuries, but the height of it is clearly the 18th century, 19th century, right? Well, 18th century and 19th century. And you see these dots, and you see the very few ships that go north, right, to the US, what is the US, and the bulk of the ships going there. And so it's from Slate. If you Google Slate, the Atlantic slave trade in 2 minutes, you'll get it. And so these are, there's more evidence of that, that tells us the prevalence of Black people throughout the hemisphere in the Americas, to understand that that really your best guess for when you meet someone who's Black, this is, I always say, is that in the Americas, in the context of the Americas, is to speak to them in Spanish or Portuguese, not in English, right? And that goes contradictory to sort of my experience, where I often am interpolated in English, and I'm like, your best guess is to try me in Spanish, especially if that's the language I'm using. So even despite, right, the evidence and the massive and the lived, the experience and the fact that there are plenty of Black people in the hemisphere, there has been this sort of like tendency to invisibilize Blackness, to not understand us Blacks as part of as part of, of the Latin American or Latinx experience to push it further. And I love this graphic, which comes from Mara Loveman's work, which really speaks to mestizaje ideologies. So in the blue box, and how it contributes to a decline in the counting of Afro-descendants in the census. So there's an ideology that really is pushing against representation to like now where there's an increase in kind of like counting race, particularly because we know that race matters. And so here we're starting to understand it's always mattered, right? Like from the moment that people were put in bondage through now, but we're starting to kind of like understand the importance of documenting that experience. And so here is an example of this comes from a report from the World Bank, a 2018 report from the World Bank on Afro-descendants that suggests that 25% of people in, across Latin America, about 25, are of African descent, right? And that can mean many things, and there's a slippage there, like what's the difference between Afro-descendant and being Black, which is now a large conversation, and where the point where we've moved even to talk about visibly Black, right? Like there's a different experience being visibly Black than sort of like identifying or referring to some Black ancestry. And so, but we see that the percentages are real and the numbers are real, where we have 132 million. If we take this particular data from the censuses across these countries, 132 million people of Afro-descended in Latin America. So this is where a lot of, this report, and there's more and more evidence. There's a lot of people doing this sort of work about inequality, racial inequality throughout Latin America and the Caribbean. And this is just a sample from this report that I find really useful. And depending on what data you use, you'll see different things, but across the way, even through our invisibility, once the data starts to be collected, we see constant patterns. So this is, for example, the share of urban population living in slums by race, and the yellow represents, or orange for you might be, represents Afro-descendants and across countries, and then the green is non-Afro-descendants. You see this pattern over and over again, where there's a lot of underprivilege, right? Of precarity, of discrimination, of racism, of harder conditions being faced by populations of African descent across the Americas. And I'll just quickly, this all come from the report, so I encourage you to look at it. So this is kind of infrastructural conditions, access to electricity, access to water, access to sewage. And these are not all consistent, that Afro-descendants are in worse situation than others. In a lot of these, like, in a lot of these, they face, right, is across the board, like race is not that big of a factor, it appears, at least from these data. And I have to say that there's a lot of questions about the reliability of the data, like who ends up, right? Like, writing themselves. And also we have to take into account that the percentage tends to be much lower for those who have identified in census as being of Afro-descendant. And so that creates sort of like an unsure of like less security in the reliability of it. But in any case, we see these patterns, and typically we might find some general patterns about, just disadvantage, right? And underprivilege for Afro-descendants. This is access to television, access to telephone, access to computers. And then this is poverty, rates of poverty in Brazil, Ecuador, Peru, Uruguay, and the greenish sort of a line on the top. This is quickly, we can see it is Afro-descendant, non-Afro-descendant is the orange in this case, and total population is the brown. So here we can quickly see that for poverty, the percentages are much higher for Afro-descendants for all three countries. Even countries, you know, some people are like that, they think there's no Black people, and I've, you know, met people from all of these countries and they've been like, oh yeah, no, that's not us, right? Uruguay, yeah, no. Well, there you go. You know, we're everywhere, right? Not, and not necessarily by choice. Well, not by choice in many instances, in most instances. But we are. And then educational attainment, you know, just look, primaries on the far left here, primary or more, so, and then secondary, and then tertiary education. The pink is non-Afro-descendant, the green is Afro-descendant. So much lower, you can see, like, this is national, the first three rural, the second three urban, the last three, but for all, Afro-descendants tend to have less educational attainment at all levels, and the disparities are pretty consistent whether you are in rural or urban areas. So, you know, there's the data in this way, but the data exists in other ways. It lives in experience, and I want to reference this. If I had more time, like I would show a bit of the video. But this is a video that went viral. It's a few years ago, and it was rather emotional, I think, for me watching the video. This is Carlos Angulo, who one day he was on his way to work at 8 a.m., walking through the streets of the city of Bogota in Colombia, and an officer stopped him and asked him for his papers. And he got very angry about it. You know, he asked, you know, why do they ask for their papers? Because they are white? Because they are citizens? Why don't you ask for their papers? Because they are from the capital city and they are not considered dangerous? Hundreds of people passed by and you stopped only 2 Black guys on the street. He was walking with another colleague. You think I'm suspicious because I'm going too fast, and my boss thinks it's suspicious when I'm late. And he goes on to say, this is a country where Blacks and whites are the same under the law. The police is the representation of the law. Let's see, who else are you stopping? That is what angers me. This hypocritical country that has had us Blacks making an enormous contribution to the nation, and it doesn't respect our humanity. That is what angers me. So all of this is in Spanish. And he has you know, and come to find out, I've looked more into Carlos Angulo. He was part of an organization and they had been documenting sort of like the treatment that Black people get in the city, in the streets of Colombia. And they had a lot of different documentation. And that day he was just fed up, right? Like he was like, okay, it stops here. There's 2 videos to this scene, and what's interesting is that the second video, we see kind of like an intervention from other people, like telling him, calm down, you know, it's okay, we're on your side, but, you know, calm down, let's do it another way, and he's just incensed. And so I talk about this particular incident to talk about the ways in which the city itself, we have the data, we know inequality happens, but the experiential sometimes comes across in ways that are unexpected and are hard to justify and explain. So the policing that happens, but also the conditions that are created in the city so that at 8 a.m. he is out of place, right? Walking through the city on his way to work. So I use this term, and racismo disimulado, so veiled, hidden, concealed, dissembled, covert. When you're denied the experience of racism, there is sort of like this, that's similar to sort of like the turn from overt racism to covert racism that happens that people talk about happening in the US, but that I suggest has often been the way it happens in Latin America, especially under the veil of racial democracy. But yet the built environment, the city, the laws, the behaviors log it and enforce it and reproduce it. And so even though it hides in plain sight, it is experienced and it is reproduced. So I use the work of Diane Harris, who's an architectural historian, to talk about the importance of landscapes and how they hide, they hide racism in plain sight, because you can see it, it's there. I sometimes change that expression to sight, instead of sight as in eyesight, to sight as in place, S-I-T-E. Which is a hallmark of white privilege. Landscapes are particularly well suited to the masking of such constructions because they appear to be completely natural, right? Oh, nothing's happening, But landscapes and architecture are never thus. They are always powerful symbols and containers of cultural values, just as they simultaneously work to construct culture. So I go back, and this is in my work, I go back to the very foundations of the Americas in Latin America. And you had you had the law of the Indies established in Latin America. And the law of the Indies was like the first urban plan established for the Americas. When Spanish sent their, colonizers, they sent them with instructions about how to colonize and how to build the new cities. So if you've ever thought of plazas in Latin America, it's like this, sort of like romantic, right? Like of who we are, representation of what Latin America is. They were actually built with defense in mind. And they were instructed to build it in a way that it was not only defensible from people attacking from outside, but also from local indigenous populations. So they were to build a ditch to avoid attacks from indigenous populations. So the very production of the built environment from the get-go of the building of the Americas was premised on creating spaces or space or our cities in a ways that excluded and enforce racial distinctions. There are many examples throughout history. This is a lighthouse that was built in Santo Domingo in Dominican Republic, which is the first, right? The site, the initial, right? The portal to colonization in the Americas and the production of the Americas. And this was built to commemorate the arrival of Christopher Columbus. And it was built and a wall was put on to separate from a low kind of like income community, a squatter community that was next to it. The irony is that this is like this shoots a beam of light into, like, you can see all the way into space, right? When in a country that suffers from power outages, right? Inconsistent electric supply and improper or insufficient infrastructural support, especially for populations who are Black, or sometimes I talk about these populations as being dark, right? Acknowledging sort of like the colorist hierarchies that are insinuated in the racial landscape of all of these countries. And if you look geographically, right, like the settlement of populations, and often people are like, oh, this is about class, like where people live, but there is such a high correlation with race, often because we haven't measured race in the Caribbean or in Latin America properly or sufficiently. We go by other ways of understanding kind of like how racial disparity manifests geographically that push beyond class. So how is the built environment like really relying on ethnographic methods, measuring kind of race, but one undeniable one is that those that tend to be high income tend to be lighter skin across the Americas. I mean, look at our government representation, look at those who are elite, tend to be in better socioeconomic condition. Of course, some data kind of supports this. This is by income in class in Santo Domingo, but this one, and this is from Jamaica, I think is a good example to show that these can be done, and this is by Colin Clark from Jamaica. You can do this to buy other types of, actually, this is not the one I wanted to show, but there's one that shows sort of like a racial geography of the city of Jamaica, which aligns with these sort of like economic measures. And there are other measures that sort of like align as well with race, things like irregular settlements, low-income families, medium and high incomes, that if we push the racial sort of like dimension, we start to see some correlation. So that's geography spatially, but we can also see it in other ways. We can see it in the monuments, in museums, and the types of celebrations that are made at the level of the built environment. So this is in Puerto Rico, Tres Razas, la cultura puertorriqueña, right? Like highlighting this, like intermixing, but who faces front, who faces back, who's in the background, right? Gets reproduced in many of our monuments, and right, like the historical legacies that are celebrated that reproduce this anti-Blackness, to more sort of like disimulado, right, to use that word, more veiled. And I wrote about a mall that was built in Puerto Rico, or the building of malls, or the policing of people in spaces that are considered to be for tourists, or for high-end or luxury, and the rules that dominate informal, and that dominate these spaces. And you know, I've experienced this in many places. I remember being in Peru and being followed in stores because, you know, what is she doing here, right? She cannot be by here. And I think in Brazil, we see examples of people forming these rolecinhos. I've written about this as well, where they actually dance and protest the fact that like Blacks are excluded from these places that are supposed to be exclusive to certain people who are sort of, it's a sense of profile, it's a racial profiling, but it's covert. It's like, oh no, you just don't, you know, I don't think you're the right person to be buying here. And so the way in which in Brazil people have protested through dancing and through different cultural forms in order to say, yeah, we belong here. And if we look closer in the city, we see sort of like more other ways in which people who are largely, you know, of African descent have to engage with the city. So these are pyramids that are put, this is also in Santo Domingo, and I took this picture, and, you know, in a Caribbean city where the sun is hot and, there's a lot of informal vending and you know, sort of like selling of things, spaces of shadow become important, right, to find refuge, and the ways in which many of low-income people, or even immigrants, right, from other parts, or Dominicans, in Dominican Republic, there's a large Haitian population, not as large as they tend to think, but you know, significant immigrant population, but also Dominicans who participate in, who tend to be Black and participate in these types of informal labor, are blocked off from sites that might make their labor, you know, more viable or less, you know, difficult already. So the city actually reproduces, and some of this is also informed kind of like by already racial, but racially, you know, architecture tends to hold race in this like unspecified terms, application of like formalized or rules of how to build, right? Proper rules of how to build that are actually housing a lot of ideas about race implicitly, which is what I do in my book, Locked In, Locked Out, for Puerto Rico, and the ways in which the built environment, the housing built environment, and the ways it was built in Puerto Rico, public housing on the one hand, and private urbanizaciones, so developments, subdivisions, kind of like contain the policies that dictated the building, and then the gating of these communities are informed by a perception and an understanding of who the people are who live there, right? And then the ways in which we need to protect, who do we need to protect and who do we have to log in? And so this is something that many people are doing and other scholars are doing. And I want to highlight some of those. Hugo Cerón Anaya wrote a really great book that just came out last year, Privilege at Play. It's about class, race, gender, and golf in Mexico. And he discusses, and this is a picture from Brazil actually in the book, which I think is one of a great picture to showcase inequality. You know, you have a favela on the left next to like this, super luxurious high rise with pools in every, or dipping pools in every terrace. But that's the picture. But the book itself is a description of how golf clubs in Mexico, the history of golf clubs in Mexico, is imbued with these racial ascriptions, race and racist ascriptions of who belongs and who doesn't. And so that's an example. I have also kind of Diana Bachel, who's at Berkeley, becoming Black political subjects about Brazil. Melissa Valle, who is working on a book on Cartagena, Colombia. This is a paper she wrote on the detachment of race from gentrification in Cartagena de Indias, Colombia, that suggests the ways in which the built environment also hides that. This is a paper from Fatima Williams, which is Afro-Colombians in the Cosmopolitan City, New Negotiations of Race and Space in Bogota, Colombia. And there she talks this is a great paper, in Latin American Perspectives Journal, that speaks to the ways in which, the city of Bogota is erected in ways that kind of like sorts Black bodies and Black people moving through it. So I want to reference, this is from LA, this is not from Latin America, but I want to reference this article that came out in the ways in which we create and produce cities, not only in renderings, architectural planning, but also in real cities that suggest that Black people have been abducted by aliens, that they don't exist. And this is a rendering that showcases, and this article showcases the way in which also this happens for places in Latin America where we actually are not supposed to exist. That's why Carlos Angulo could not be there, because that city, Bogota, was not for him, is not for him. And in many places, so through the questioning of whether we belong, whether we can speak the language, whether Black people are able to do their labor in that context, right? Like with the pyramids, that you're not supposed to be there. There are many ways in which the city recalls that very beginning law of the Indies that excluded the indigenous from participating and from being sort of like part of this supposed racial democracy that we're supposed to. So it's premised on this idea of invisibility. And there was this great article that recently came out about the city that kept slavery silent, right? Or that city where you won't find traces of Blackness because we have only reclaimed it as a Spanish city and then as a mestizo city. So that I'll end there and look forward to the conversation and discussion.
Thank you so much, Professor Dinzey-Flores, for sharing with us your valuable experiences and knowledge with us tonight. We truly value your presence and participation here today, and want to acknowledge that these topics are not frequently talked about, and they're really important, especially when it comes to built urban spaces, like our own cities and the anti-Blackness found within them. We want to keep the conversation going, and we will now be opening up to our Q&A session. Alexa Polaka here will help us guide through the questions. Feel free to type in more questions as we're answering them on the Q&A box or on the chat box. And you may also use the raise hand feature if you would like to ask the question yourself. We can also do that, and I will allow for you to verbally ask the question. Alexa, if you want to ask the first question.
Yes, the first question is for both speakers, and it says, does self-identification of Afro-Latinx tend more to do with the phenotype of the individual being visibly Black or of African descent, or is an acknowledgement of African descent enough to adopt that identity? And a second question for that is, how can the identity resist being co-opted without being so gate-kept that individuals feel discouraged from exploring their Afro-descendant lineage? And whoever wants to start can start. I think Zaire was unmuted.
Oh, okay, I can go. I have to say that that's the one of the trickier questions I think that have come up recently, and there have been some kind of good reasons for it to come up, because there is kind of like this greater celebration, right, of and respect for African contributions and culture and recognition, right, that we exist, and has led to some kind of like debates about how to claim it and when to claim it and under what conditions to claim it. There are different ways to enter the question for me. And one of the distinctions, I think that, and I'm part of this collective called the Black Latinas No Collective, and one of the members, Nancy Lopez, has used this concept of street race, like what's your street race, versus, and I've called the other kind of race tu abuela donde está race, that's like where's your grandmother, your ancestors' race, and I think they work. They're useful in different settings. I think what is tough is when the abuela donde está race kind of like takes over, which is, I mean, I think it's well-intentioned. The sort of like, yeah, my parents were Black too, or my grandparents were Black too, and I'm not. I think it's well-intentioned, but in some instances, it actually makes it hard to understand how race works, right? Like racism. So I think that we have to be thoughtful about the instances in which we kind of insinuate different elements of race in the, if it, in my view, it helps nobody if we're talking about, for example, racial profiling. And I often, to talk about the ways in which, I too am Black. Spike Lee has a great scene in this movie that now it's old, but it was not old, called Bamboozled. And at the end, it's about minstrelsy and the history of minstrelsy, this film. And at some point, they're being arrested, like a group of Black people are being arrested, and they had one white collaborator, and this is US, in the context of the US, right? So African-American and white, and the police are arresting everyone except the white person. The white person's like, arrest me too, right? And it's like, well, in some instances, not being Afro-descendant, but not visibly Black will warrant you that experience. And so we have to understand the moments where that experience needs to be kind of centered in anti-racism and anti-Blackness efforts. So it's not an easy answer, but there are times where like it's not about identity, but the ways, because race is a social construction. It's not real. We're not really anything, we're not really race, but it's real. It's a fact because it operates to inform experience, right? And inform access and inequality, in access and opportunity, and results in inequality. So when do we invoke different things? I think shifts in different contexts. That's a long answer, and it's not even, a little bit of the conversation.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's one of the major questions that the students really grapple with. I had one Afro-Latina, self-identified Afro-Latina say, if she would say, my Afro-Latina identity is interchangeably with Black. And if that's not the case for you, then, you really can't call yourself Afro-Latina. I do agree that everybody gets to identify however they want. And that shouldn't be the focus. I completely agree with Dr. Dinzey-Flores that this is really about centering Blackness and more centering anti-Blackness and centering anti-racism, and really building a solidarity around these political points. And so I often have students ask me that. I will say that, for example, one of the amazing conversations were along with other fellow African-American classmates. And some of the African-American classmates rightfully felt somewhat like, you're late to the party, right? You're late to the game. Where have you been? And I think that's a valid point. I also think that we have to grow and build. And so I think this point of absolutely this identity should not be co-opted, but points of solidarity shouldn't be gatekeeping as well. So I often try to, while we talk about identity and culture a lot in my class, I try to then steer them to talking about, well, what does that really mean, right? What does it mean that lighter skinned Latinos do in fact have much more privilege than darker skinned and especially Afro-Latinos. So we have those conversations. And so the other conversation I have with my students is that of allies, right? So you can be someone's ally without having to identify as that group and be a strong ally, and actually maybe in some points step back and not speak and listen, and in some place to step forward and defend Afro-Latino folk. So I think it is very situational and regional, and that matters. But the focus has to be working towards an anti-racist agenda. And I think at the towards the end of the class, folks really are starting to feel that solidarity in very, very important ways. As we saw so many, for example, in Los Angeles, there was hundreds of thousands. There's just more Latinos, let's say, in LA than Black folk. And there was just a sea of Chicanos, brown and light-skinned Chicanos at the Black Lives Matter movement, who completely understood, shared. And in those moments, I think it was really powerful because it wasn't someone's individual identity. It was really this collective mass of folks fighting racism and discrimination for Black and brown folk.
Yeah. If I may add another example that I think is useful to think about, this is from Brazil. So some years ago, Brazil enacted affirmative action for university admissions. And they did because the numbers of Afro-descendants was so low at universities. And they enacted it. And then when they went to see the results, the demographics or the landscape at the university had not changed much. Because what happened is that those applicants that were admitted under affirmative action kind of like gestures, right, or policies to diversify the university were saying, I'm of African descent, which, you know, no reason to doubt it, right? Like in terms of like maybe their parents or grandpa or, you know, generations down the line, right? But they still kind of like enjoyed the privileges of a racist, colorist society, right? That provided more opportunities than the people who were dark skinned. And so they had to kind of reassess, and I've met some of the people who were working on reassessing the way to measure racial disadvantage, which included things that we don't want to do and return to, like, you know, skin color and hair texture, and even like, you know, facial features that biologize, right? Make race like uncomfortable because it's not real. So why are we going to return to those racist, right? Like conceptualizations of what race means. And yet we have to kind of acknowledge that that's the medium. Those are the means of enacting, of practicing, enacting racism, right? Like, so if those are the means, how do we get to address that? So I think, I mean, yes, it's a matter of like thinking the particular context under which we're thinking of you know, claiming certain experiences.
Thank you both for your answer. We have another question, and first the attendee says, hello, thank you both for speaking today. What would be the best way to speak about colorism among family members?
Yeah, you know, it's really hard. I think one way that the students and I came up with is having a general, to begin with a general point of entry versus an individual point of entry. You know, most folks don't like confrontation. So if you come out with someone with like, you know, they're not going to listen. But so for example, sometimes with my mom, right, she's watching something on television and I'm like, like, you know, did you hear this point? And then that opens up the dialogue. So many of the students, for example, will state something like, you know, or the family member will say something like, oh, I'm tired of all these people questioning us. We use those terms as endearment, right? Where we say with cariño, with love, with, you know. And so one of the things the students began to be able to point out or to the family was say, you know, I'm not necessarily questioning your intent, right? But the larger behavior that happens around preferences of siblings, for example, is one very much based on skin color, hair texture, and so on. So I often would say to a family member, you could say all you want that, you know, negrita was a term of endearment, but my experience, my feelings, people's behavior towards me was one of least preference. So kind of letting them know this matchup, right? Of like, oh, well, that means we love you the most, or da 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 da. And then say to them, well, but you know, you then say, don't date or marry someone dark. But that's odd, you know. You also state that the newborn in the family, oh my gosh, I think he has a chance of getting green eyes, you know. Do you ever say, oh my goodness, you know, do you ever hear someone say, oh my goodness, this kid is dark and beautiful, right? So kind of, I remember I would tell my father, and I love my father's a brilliant storyteller, but he would tell these stories and he would say, oh, this tall, blonde, blue-eyed, gorgeous woman, right? He would never, ever, ever describe a Black person like that. The Black person was short, never beautiful, never, you know. So I would say to my dad, you know, Dad, you always describe the person when they're white, and in these very positive ways. Oh, and then he goes, oh, I do that with everybody. Oh, no, I don't mean anything by it. So I would say, okay, well, tell me an instance where you said this, you know, beautiful Black woman, and he's like, you know, and I can tell that it's this generational, right? This is what we get taught. It's that psychological moment that we can stop for us and our children. And so it's not easy, but or sometimes I would say like, wow, Mom, like, these novelas, you think we're all blonde, blue-eyed. And then my mom would be like, oh, well, and I'm like, And so you can, if you have a large point of entry, some point where you're watching some television or something like that, and then making it personal and bringing it up to them and saying, I didn't feel very loved, even with those terms of endearment. I felt that my lighter skinned siblings had special preference, X, Y, Z. And then you can begin that conversation and you can begin that healing. And I've had folks in my family apologize to me and have conversations. It's not easy, but I think it's important. I think it's opportunities to heal our families from this racial trauma of erasure of Blackness.
Thank you, Professor.
Professor Dinzey-Flores, if you would like to add to that question, or?
I mean, not really. I think that covers it. I think they're difficult conversation, and I think it depends on, the composition of your family, right? I mean, I think that there's also sort of like this sort of assumption that Latino families have like this, they're all colors, we're the rainbow people, right? And that is not always the case. And I think that, I say, I was having a conversation with a friend who's not Black, Latina, and she was talking about her kid, and she's very progressive and kind of like has this, I consider an ally, in this addressing racism. And she was dealing with her child wanting to take a doll to school that was Black, but kind of hesitating. And this is in the context of Latin America, hesitating because the kids would react in a way, right? In Latin America, it's often the case where, we don't expect Black dolls and we don't expect, that's not what beauty is. And that is, we see it in media, we see it in all kinds of images, that there's no, and she said, she's like, and we decided it was too tough to have that conversation right through my 5-year-old or 6-year-old. And I said to her, it's like, interesting, that's your conversation. But my kid takes himself to school and my kid looks like me, like, same skin color, curly, big afro, right? And so her conversation is very different than the conversation I need to be having, right? We cannot avoid it. It's not about sending a doll, it's about him himself, right? So I cannot not send him to school in the context to have that conversation. So I think that it matters, that context. And I think we also have to kind of like consider, and I think that Professor Lacayo alluded to this, right? Like the pain and that it means that these conversations involve for some of us, and highlight that about it. I've taken the route because I've suffered so much. There was so much resistance when I would talk about racism in the context of my Latino people, that I was like, oh, this is why I studied race as codified. This is why I'm gonna study it in a social science way. Like, let's not deny. And I think that is helpful for people to see that these are not feelings, not only feelings, but these are actual, there's data, there's evidence that have social consequences.
Yes, I would like to move on to another question along the same lines. And first of all, thank you for the insightful presentations. Both of you are professors in higher education, and it is evident to me that education is vital to combat the racial bias that exists in Latin America and the Caribbean. How is or can this information be accessible early on to young children in K-12 institutions? I attended public school, and it was not until I reached higher education that these discussions became accessible to me.
I think this is an excellent question. I think it would really help to start earlier. what I saw with the respondents, with my students, was like they only acquired the language when they got to college. How can you know, how can you feel something, experience it, but not name it? You don't, I mean, racismo translates, but for some folks it doesn't, in some families. And so my daughter, who's Afro-Latina, her father's African-American, she goes to a predominantly white school. She goes to the UCLA Lab School. And they teach them slavery in kindergarten, and they teach them all of this. They talk about, mass police shootings. But now that it's COVID, I hear the teachers. And part of the issue is most of the teachers are white. So there's days I cringe at what she's hearing. And so my daughter has to, every minute be like, that's wrong. No, that didn't happen that way. And so I think about, I don't know what's worse, erasure or bad teaching, right? Where students then only get reinforced, only the racism in some ways get reinforced by these very lovely white liberal teachers, well-intentioned, but they don't know what they're talking about, or the way that they're putting forth the curriculum is really problematic. And there's days where I'm like, I just wish they wouldn't talk about it at all, because I feel like they're doing more damage. So I think the answer, or part of the answer, is we need to have more media, more programming, more family. But in terms of K through 12, this is why so many people have been fighting for ethnic studies, for history to actually reflect what happened. There's been major Afro-Latino contributions in this country from the beginning, from before the beginning. People don't know this. Why do people not know this? As a professor was saying, there was 95% of the slave ships were in Latin America, not the US. You would think it's the opposite. You think Latin America thinks that it's the opposite, and the US thinks it's the opposite. So that K through 12 education is critical. And I really, truly believe we'd be in a much better place if we had young students know about this, but it has to come with training. Like the teachers have to be trained, because sometimes they end up doing more harm than good. And so I really believe in ethnic studies, because ethnic studies is folks of color that have been doing this social science research and evidence. These are the experts. So if maybe there was a way to then teach the teachers on how to deliver the content, because the delivery of the content is just as important as the content, and both of those need to change through K through 12. And I firmly believe that y'all's millennial generation, that's something you all can really do, and it would make a huge difference.
Yeah, I really don't have much to add. I second, third, fourth, everything you said, Dr. Lacayo, with ethnic studies. I mean, in theory, all teachers get some kind of education, and what does it mean to make that required, right? Like for the teachers, for the trainers, so that they then are able, I think, what better argument for ethnic studies than in Puerto Rico, Isar Godreau and some colleagues developed a book about addressing race and racism in the public school system that was integrated into the curriculum. I'm sure there are some examples. I found very frustrating in kind of like the more recent racial uprisings, that suddenly everybody felt like they had to address it and felt like they were qualified to address it. And I think also kind of resulted in some of these challenges around what was being and how it was being relayed in the service of anti-racism. I think in the kind of like long historical view, I think it's more a hope than a thought. I hope that it's a move forward to do it, in some way, and hopefully it will become better, but we'll see.
Thank you. Your answers were very They're very crucial to everything that's happening right now. And I feel like this is going to inspire so much conversation about what we can do in the future. So to respect all of our times, we will do 2 more questions and continuing the conversation about spreading awareness and just like reforming. Countries such as Bolivia and Mexico barely began to recognize its Black communities within the last 10 years. Beyond recognition, what do you believe to be the next steps to combat racial inequality in these countries?
Yeah. I mean, I think recognition as a social scientist, I think that it's so important. Like Mexico's Afro-descendant population is like, it was invisible and now it's visible. And so what those censuses do is that they provide information, right? Like all those tables, all those graphs I showed, are possible if we have that data. And if we have data like this, much like the census here, right, participating, you know, that some scholars have suggested like the most important political act we can do is participate in the census, right? Because they determine resources, because they determine voting districts, you know, the representation, it's one of the most important acts to do. And if we are counted, and there was an attempt to undo, which might have come back, but like undo the sort of like all Latinos into one bundle. And if we do that, you know, when you answer the race question and you're like, oh no, I'm not Black or white or whatever, I'm other, you basically choose to say identify ethnically, right, or panethnically rather than racially, escaping that question, then we're unable to understand how race functions for Latinos. So it's similar to what, you know, invisibility in Latin America. So I think step 1 is, yes, visibility. Step 2 is really understanding the landscape of opportunity along racial lines. So a lot of social science and a lot of, you know, kind of like pruning those methods. And then it's policy, right? Like policies that are directed at addressing those inequities in different realms. And I'm not saying that it's like blanket policies. I'm saying they're targeted. If we know that in, you know, Brazil in education, this is how it works, how do we create more racial equity? We saw it's not about asking a question like, are you of African descent? It involves something much more precise for that context. And so I think, you know, Costa Rica elected the vice president for Costa Rica is a Black Afro Costa Rican woman, and her presence, and she had worked on racial inequality for a long time, and her presence is important. Legislation, courts, policies need to kind of acknowledge race and understand the way it operates in order to undo some of that. And I'll say that unsuspectedly, I wrote this book about gated communities, and it ended up being a central argument, or used for argument for Jehovah's Witness that wanted to have the opportunity to proselytize in gated communities. And my argument had not, you know, it was about class and race inequality. But at the end of the day, if we protect civil rights in one sense, we protect civil rights in another way, right? And so the argument to make all public spaces accessible to everyone freely, right? It does not only serve Black low-income people, it serves kind of like our own sense of justice. So, you know, that's policy, I think, is extremely important.
Yeah, I definitely echo that, everything. I would also add that, especially with the Mexico case, so much, we were seeing so much kind of resurgence of this Afro-Mexican identity. simultaneously, the state has said, just horrible things like, okay, well, we did the census and it wasn't that many people, and it was a small percentage, but it's still millions of people. And of course, that's an undercount because folks may or may not identify, but very well be, or, census is not the most accurate data. It's critical. And then we're also seeing this instances of culture, right, which is also important because it's empowering to regain your culture and all of that. But what we have seen, particularly in the history of Latin America, is that Black culture also is used as a distraction, right? So capoeira, Brazil, we're not racist, right? And it's like, okay, we don't want to go that route. We want to make sure that when we're talking about the Afro-descendant population or Black population, that we're specifically addressing the racial inequalities, right? So that you're not only recognizing the group or that identity or culture, but that you're recognizing that that group identity culture has been oppressed, has been erased. And as you were saying, that policies need to be created and enacted to bring that back to some kind of equality. And of course, it's not to say not to celebrate the beautiful richness of those cultures, but to also make sure that the state governments don't co-opt that culture, because we're also seeing that too, where the states then decide to co-opt that culture, make it a tourist economy, make money off of that, and still disinvest in those very communities and folks. And so we certainly don't want to have those pitfalls that Latin America has before. But I agree, we are seeing, just Brazil passing affirmative action, as problematic as it is, the Black movements in Latin America from the onset have to be recognized and have made major changes and continue to do so.
Thank you. As our last question, we're gonna shift the gears a little bit. This one is about economic growth. So past years have shown economic growth of the middle class in Latin America. Has this growth helped racial inequality, or has it excluded Black communities?
I don't know the answer to that. And I would question even the growth of middle class in Latin America. I don't know for sure, but for years there was an ongoing contraction, right? Of the middle class. Latin America is the most unequal region in the hemisphere. Inequality is very, very, very high. And I think visible in many different ways. I think we need a historical analysis. Some of those graphs I showed are historical. They showed some years and what the gaps have remained stagnant by race. But I think I would just start by questioning, because those are kind of inflated neoliberal infused kind of GPD kind of veiled, disimulado of the economic growth for many Latin American countries that can be visible in kind of depressions that, right, like Argentina, for example, that showcase that, and Chile, showcase that these were more figments of kind of these neoliberal political economic arrangements that really benefited a small elite, a very small elite. So I would question that, but I don't know the answer to that. And that's partly, it's a great study. I would encourage anyone to do it. But I think it's also partly on the limits of the data that we have available for race in the region. But
I would answer it more too as a more representational and symbolic narratives and rhetoric is important. So we know that when Obama became president, this colorblind, right? So there's no more racism. we've ushered in our first Black president. And I think we see instances of that in Latin America too, when certain indigenous or folks from different marginalized groups have ascended to some kind of power, or there's some visibility or some representation, often very little. Folks rely back on this, well, there we are, there we go, we're kind of done here, right? We don't need to talk about that. And I think this goes to the social dominance theory, where you in order to dominate a group, you need a couple of them to do well, right? So that people can't say, well, if you work hard, you're going to do it. Obama worked hard, so clearly Black people can do it. And I think that happens in Latin America as well. And I think that gets further masked, for example, in countries like Mexico, where they're always like, oh, this isn't about race, it's about class. This is a class issue, when the class and race is so interdependent in Latin America. And so again, it's this erasure of desiring to speak about race and these racial inequalities. And so I think for me, it's the agenda always has to center that Black experience and how to improve the lives, of education, health, employment, all factors down the line for visibly Black folk in Latin America.
Yeah, thank you both for answering that question. And I just saw in the chat, and I have to ask, someone asked Professor Dinzey-Flores, where is the best place to buy your book?
It's published by the University of Pennsylvania Press, and I would guide people there. But of course, it's on all booksellers, including two large booksellers. But
okay, great, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much to both of our speakers. Before we conclude this event, I would like to give space for both of our speakers to give closing remarks. If there's any message you would like to leave us with tonight, I'll make space for that.
So my other work is also on Latino and African American relations, and we continue, the dominant paradigm between Black and Brown folks in the media continues to be that they're at each other's throat, and it's negative, and there's so much tension. And yes, there is that, but I live in a predominantly Black area, historically Black area, with now a lot of Latinos and Afro-Latinos. And every day I see instances of solidarity between these groups that the media chooses not to look at, and that they're helping each other out, that they're helping their children out, that they're babysitting each other's neighbors' kids, that African Americans are learning to speak Spanish in Los Angeles, that Latinos know who famous and well-known contributors of the Black culture are. And I'm seeing more of that, and I don't want to over-celebrate, but I think the political solidarity that we see on the streets with these large protests for Black Lives Matter, and of course, along, understanding that Latinos are also racialized in their own way, forming really strong, I think there are parts of this country that are very threatened by that, because divide and conquer has worked so well for the colonizer for so long. And I'm finally seeing instances of, there's always been solidarity between Black and Brown, but I think y'all's generation can really flip it. And the population is growing. We're going to be majority by a certain time. But one valuable lesson we learned from Latin America is we take Brazil. Brazil's 80% Black, and 20% of the population dominates all areas. So we know that population is not destiny. We have to really convert the numbers with voting and political behavior. But I think that solidarity is there, and I can hope and see that with the next generations, it can grow for social justice.
So I'm gonna take it more in a intimate level, thinking of John Jackson has this great book on racial paranoia, and it's very US context and in the context of African American and kind of like white American version of race. But towards the end, he talks about like the intimate sites where we need to kind of like address race in order to, so the intimate conversations, and this kind of recalls the question that was asked about how to talk to families, but I even push further to kind of like look at ourselves. And I think that often kind of this invisibility, I think, is one of the most troubling aspects of race and racism in the context of Latin America and Latinxes, like in the US, Latinx communities, kind of like the thought that we don't exist, that Black people don't exist within Latinidad, within Latin America, and within the Caribbean and our communities. And so I often say kind of, and it's a very tricky thing that shows up in the most kind of banal ways that I would just kind of like lift, raise your antenna. Jasmine Haywood, a scholar, wrote a paper about like the most violent places as a Black Latina, as Afro-Latina, are Latinx spaces, right? So I would encourage, all of us to think about the ways in which we already invisibilize, take away kind of like the idea of Blackness from our spaces, from our thoughts, from our minds, in the everyday, sort of assumptions of who belongs to our communities, about who can relate to our culture, about the ways our culture looks, right? I talk a lot about that language dimension to it, because language is not a measure of Latinidad, right? Like there are many languages, there are many interlanguages and mixes of languages, but the ways in which Black subjects or Black bodies are kind of excluded from that participation. So test your assumptions. Kind of think about when we watch TV, who's on TV, when we think of like who are our people and what we might be missing, and sort of like reproducing these racist orders in the way we behave based on our assumptions of what Latinidad or what Latin Americanism looks like. So that's my kind of like ideal sort of call to action.
Professor Celia Lacayo, Professor Zaire Dinzey-Flores, we're so grateful here as our community here of having you tonight and being part of this important conversation, and leaving us with such a powerful message. I just really want to thank both of you for being here tonight and sharing the space and sharing your experiences, sharing your thoughts and your research, and just leaving us with such a powerful message. Thank you. We really appreciate you.
Thank you so much. Thank you all.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, this event will now be concluded. We appreciate all of our audience members as well. I hope you all learned something new and really appreciate this space tonight. Have a great night, everyone. Thank you.
Good night.
Thanks.
Good night. Thank you so much.
Thank you.